What's up everybody, and welcome back to the Cyclonic Thrift channel. Today we're continuing to look at some of the new fun commanders from the Modern Horizons 3 set, and today we have 6. No, it's just one commander, named 6, that's right. One half of one of the more famous planeswalkers we've got in the whole Magic the Gathering universe. He's got his own card. He is back, he is running the show, and he's got a pretty fun ability that we're going to build a fun deck around. So the card is, as I said, 6, 2 and a green for a 2/4 legendary creature Treefolk. He's got reach. Whenever he attacks, you mill 3 cards, and then you may put a land card from among them, meaning those milled cards, into your hand. And as long as it's your turn, non-land permanent cards in your graveyard have retrace, which means you can cast the permanent card from your graveyard by discarding a land card in addition to paying its other costs. So what does this mean? It essentially means that your graveyard is going to turn into a second hand here. As long as you've got lands in your hand that you're able to discard, you'll be able to cast pretty much whatever you want out of your graveyard. So we're talking creatures, we're talking enchantments, we're talking artifacts, all the good stuff. So this deck is going to be largely built around taking advantage of that ability. So we're going to be milling cards, putting cards into our graveyard, but also making sure our hand is full of lands, right? Because without lands in our hand, we don't have access to those cards in our graveyard. So putting cards from our graveyard into our hand, using kind of the reveal the top X amount of cards from your library, put a land into your hand, that sort of deal, just to make sure that we have plenty of ammunition to be able to access the cards in our graveyard. And other than that, we're going to be doing some classic green stuff, right? We're going to be ramping, getting a lot of mana, casting a lot of big things, and because of this excellent retrace recursion ability we've got, our opponents are really rarely going to be ever rid of those big powerful beaters, because if they kill them, we just bring them right back. So to start off, I want to talk about some of those cards that we're going to work on both milling and then putting lands into our hands. And the first one is Circle of the Land Druid. Fits beautifully into both categories here. It's 1 and a green for a 1/1 creature gnome druid. When it enters the battlefield, you may mill 4 cards. We'll most likely be doing that. And then when it dies, you return target land card from your graveyard to your hand. Easy peasy. You get it down, you get the ETB trigger. It's just going to fuel your ability. And then later in the game, when this dies, you get the land back. You can then discard that land and play it again with 6, again, milling those 4 cards. It's a great way to kind of bounce back and forth. It's an excellent ETB trigger. It's going to work really, really well in this deck. Second card is Perpetual Timepiece. It's 2 mana for an artifact. You tap it to mill 2 cards. And you can pay 2 and exile it to shuffle any number of target cards from your graveyard into your library. So the one downside and one big weakness of mill-based decks is that eventually you run out of cards in your library, right? And depending on how aggressive you are with that mill, that can be turned into kind of a dicey situation late in games. This card just allows us to kind of reset whenever we want, right? It's a one-time reset, but it also will accelerate our strategy at the beginning of the game. You get this down early, you just save it for a rainy day. And hey, if someone destroys it, or it happens to be a card that you mill into your graveyard, it's low enough in mana cost that you'll be able to cast it from your graveyard with 6 pretty easily and utilize its ability then. Then we've got cards like Relentless Pursuit. So instants and sorceries, just like this. It's 2 and a green. To reveal the top 4 cards of your library, you may put a creature card and or a land card from among them into your hand and put the rest into your graveyard. So it's kind of a 3 mana draw 2. At worst it's a 3 mana draw 1. Well, I guess at worst it's 3 mana mill 4, which is pretty bad. But in a deck like this, we've got a lot of creatures, we've got a lot of lands. You're most likely hitting both. And even if you just hit one, you're getting that card in your hand. You're adding into your graveyard a bunch of cards you can use later. This will be a nice little engine piece that will help kind of keep both your hand and your graveyard at a healthy level. And now we get into some cards that are going to be useful as we go through the game in not letting us I guess, lose access to the retraceability. Because as we're discarding lands, right, we're going to want to be able to get those back eventually, right? Because if we're just pitching all our lands into our graveyard and we're not playing them, we're not utilizing their mana, then yes, it's powerful, but ultimately we want to be able to have some cards that can get us those lands back. So this first one, Bag of Holding, it's one mana for an artifact. Whenever you discard a card, you exile that card from your graveyard. So you still get the discard effect for the retraceability, but then the land kind of goes under Bag of Holding, or into Bag of Holding, I guess, more canonically. And then it has a couple abilities. So you pay 2 and tap it to draw a card and then discard a card. And then you pay 4 and tap it to sacrifice it and return all cards exiled with it to your hand. So essentially, it's just going to double up on all of our discarding land stuff, because we'll discard it first, exile it, and then later, sacrifice this, put 4 or 5 lands back into our hand. We can do it all over again. And again, being a low mana permanent, we can cast it from our graveyard with 6 and just kind of repeat the cycle here. It's actually going to be really nice. Next card is Creeping Renaissance. It's 3 and 2 green for a sorcery. You choose a permanent type and return all cards of the chosen type from your graveyard to your hand. And then it also has flashback for a little bit more. I've been using this card a lot in some of the deck builds recently, especially in green, and green that are centered around permanents. This is just awesome. I mean, depending on the point you play it in the game, especially in a mill-based strategy like ours, you could potentially get 10 cards off of this thing, right? You could get 10 lands, especially since we're actively discarding them into our graveyard. You could pay 5 mana, get those 10 lands back into your hand, and then utilize them however you wish. And finally, we've got a great saga here. It's Mending of Dominaria, 3 and 2 green for a saga. The first 2 chapters are you mill 2 cards, and then you can return a creature card from your graveyard to your hand. So again, fits in the mill strategy. We're getting ammunition back into our hand. And the third chapter is you return all land cards from your graveyard to the battlefield, then shuffle your graveyard into your library. So again, presumably, we're going to have a lot of land cards in our graveyard, and while this doesn't get them back to our hand, this is going to ramp us 8 mana basically in a turn, depending on the game. And it's just going to be a super powerful piece. And again, it's a permanent, so with 6 we can just cast this again out of our graveyard and utilize its effects over and over again. And now I just want to talk about the classic mono green shenanigans where we're just casting a bunch of massive creatures. First is Giant Ataphage, 5 and 2 green for a 7/7 creature insect. It's got trample. Whenever it deals combat damage to a player, you create a token that's a copy of it. So it's Scoot Swarm on steroids. Much harder to make copies with this card than Scoot Swarm. But, I mean, hey, you got a 7/7 beater down there. It's going to start copying itself out the wazoo. People kill it, and you can just bring it back. Artisan of Kozilek, 9 mana for a 10/9 Eldrazi. When you cast it, you may return target creature card from the graveyard to the battlefield, and it's got Annihilator 2. We're going to have a ton of massive creatures in our graveyard because of the milling effect, so you'll most likely be able to get a very sweet-looking target for this thing when you cast it. And it's just a beater, man. Just a big old beater. And then finally, this one's a little bit more, has a little bit more utility. It's Endray's Forerunners, 5 and 3 green for a 7/7 creature boar. Vigilance, Trample, and Haste. And when it enters the battlefield, other creatures you control get +2/+2 and gain Vigilance and Trample until end of turn. So, not a Craterhoof. It's the budget version of Craterhoof. It'll be a bit of a game ender depending on the time that you play it. But again, one of those big old beaters that are going to help win you the game after you're done ramping and recurring all your cards from your graveyard. Now I want to talk about the vegetable portion of the deck. For those who haven't seen the channel before, the vegetable portion is just where I talk about some groups of cards that you absolutely have to include into your deck when you're building budget, into the categories of ramp, card draw, and removal. if any of these categories are sparse or lacking or just not up to snuff, you're not going to be able to play consistently enough to keep up with the higher budget, higher powered decks at the table. You got to have a bunch of cards into each of these categories. They're not always the most fun, but they are going to help you perform consistently and have a more enjoyable time at the table. So first with ramp, we've got Llanowar Elves, classic green ramp. It's 1 green for a 1/1 creature elf druid, and you tap to add a green. Colony Heart Expedition is 1 and a green for an enchantment. It's got landfall, so whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, you may put a quest counter on Colony Heart Expedition. And then you remove 3 quest counters from Colony Heart Expedition and sacrifice it. And then you search your library for up to 2 basic land cards, put them on the battlefield tapped, and then shuffle. This is an awesome ramp card. I love it because I've seen it so much in landfall decks, but in this deck it's also particularly good because it's a low mana permanent. So even when we sacrifice it to get the lands out of our library, we can play it again with 6 and just repeat it over and over again. And this is going to ramp us a ton over the course of the game. Then we've got Tato Farmer, 2 and a green for a 1/4 creature zombie mutant peasant from the new Fallout set. Also has landfall. Whenever land enters the battlefield under your control, you may get 2 rad counters. And then you can tap to put target land card in a graveyard that was milled this turn onto the battlefield under your control tapped. So this actually fits into 2 categories. It fits into the self-mill category as well because we're getting those rad counters. But to be able to pull lands from any graveyard, not just our own, from cards that were milled that way, is super nice. The rad counters alone would make this a playable card, but then also being able to take advantage of getting the lands out of our graveyard is really, really nice. Moving on to card draw, we've got Culling Deus. It's 2 mana for an artifact. You tap to sacrifice a creature, put a charge counter on Culling Deus, and then you can pay 1 to sacrifice Culling Deus and draw a card for each charge counter on it. So this is a nice way to, as the game goes on, kind of accumulate counters and pay 1 mana to draw a few cards. It's especially nice for cards that have death triggers or ETBs, right? So creatures we want to get into our graveyard to then recast, get that ETB again, like Circle of the Land Druid at the beginning of this video. Next is Lifecrafter's Bestiary, 3 mana for an artifact. At the beginning of your upkeep, you scry 1. Whenever you cast a creature spell, you may pay green, and if you do, you draw a card. Super easy, super simple, and it's going to be super powerful in this deck. Then you've got Garruk's Pack Leader, 4 and a green for a 4/4 creature beast. Whenever another creature with power 3 or greater enters the battlefield under your control, you may draw a card. Quite a few creatures in this deck with power 3 or greater. Not going to be that hard to hit this multiple times. I really wanted to put Garruk's Uprising into this deck, but the way that it's built, there just aren't as many creatures with power 4 or greater, so this opens it up to a greater number of possible triggers. So this is well worth it in this deck list. Then we get to removal. First card is Lignify. It's 1 and a green for an enchantment Treefolk Aura. You enchant a creature and it becomes a 0/4 Treefolk with no abilities. So this type of aura enchantment removal onto creatures is pretty common. I like this one because, again, it's a permanent card, it's low cost, so even if they happen to get rid of it or the creature that it was attached to died and this goes to the graveyard, you can then recast it on whatever the new threat at the table is. So it's a bit of a repeatable removal instead of the one-off instant sorcery. Similarly, you've got Seal of Primordium. It's 1 and a green for an enchantment, and you sacrifice it to destroy target artifact or enchantment. You can replay it out of your graveyard and keep the train rolling. Then you've got Terastodon, 6 and 2 green for a 9/9 creature elephant. When it enters the battlefield, you may destroy up to 3 target non-creature permanents. For each permanent put into a graveyard this way, its controller creates a 3/3 green elephant creature token. So again, this is kind of just the big mana beater that you want to play, but comes with the added utility of being 3 beast withins pretty much. Can be from all the same player. If someone's really pulling away, you can spread the love a little bit. But this is just classic mono green shenanigans here. And speaking of classic mono green shenanigans, That brings us to the Thrift Pick of this deck. For those of you who, again, haven't seen the channel before, Thrift Pick is the card that I am most excited to play in this deck. It might not be objectively the best, it's not the most efficient, maybe not the most expensive card in the deck, but it's the card that when I was building the deck, am pretty excited to see play out. And the card for this deck is Rumbleweed. 10 and a green for an 8/8 creature plant elemental from the new Outlaws of Thunder Junction set. This spell costs 1 less to cast for each land card in your graveyard. Surprise, surprise, there's going to be a lot of land cards in our graveyard because we're going to be discarding them. It has Vigilance, Reach, and Trample. And then when it enters the battlefield, other creatures you control get +3/+3 and gain Trample until end of turn. So again, this kind of Crater Hoof effect, but it's going to be much, much easier to get out than like the Endray's Forerunners, for example, because of that discount. I mean, 10 land cards in our graveyard is not a hard number to hit, so casting this for 1 and giving everybody +3/+3 and Trample is pretty sweet. It's something that I'm very, very excited to see play out, and I cannot wait to just slam this down at some point and take people out with it. That brings us to the end of the video. Hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, please give the video a like. Comment down below if you can think of any cards that I should have included, might have missed. Some pet cards of your own, cards that you love throwing into mono green decks. If you're not already, please subscribe to the channel. And until next time, stay safe and stay thrifty.